So the starting point on any meeting on the Holocaust is that it is the greatest crime in human history. And this is not because millions were murdered in a genocide. That has happened to other groups of people. It's actually because of the planned, meticulously organised methods of mass murder which ended in modern, industrialised, purpose-built factories of death, which, with the whole process, claimed 6 million people from one ethnic background, Jews, as well as between 4 to 6 million other people. And the role of Marxists is to try and explain the world in order to change it, and in this situation, actually to prevent another such crime of human history. And why do we have to understand it? Because actually conditions that helped lead to the Holocaust in the past, of capitalist economic crisis, of racism, the rise of the far right, those conditions are existing today, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of the meeting. So the first thing to say, the official approach to the Holocaust is that it was a uniquely Jewish event. And it's absolutely right that we have Holocaust Memorial Day events. Jewish people were the central target of the Nazis, and they suffered the most numerically, losing half of the world population. And the virulent anti-Semitism of the Nazi party was at the core of their beliefs. But they were biological racists and supremacists, and they had many groups which they despised and thought were inferior. So LGBT plus people, asocials, mentally ill, communists, disabled people, Roma and many others all suffered under the Nazi regime. So how could this happen, this mass murder? There were a number of arguments that put forward, and I'm going to come back to them towards the latter half of the meeting. First, I think you have to trace the process. To understand the arguments, you have to trace the process which led to the Holocaust. And we need to start with how the Nazis came to power. So, we're Marxists, we're dialectical materialists. That means we look at the relationship between Nazi ideas, the ideology, and actually what was going on economically and politically in Germany at the time. So Germany emerged from the brutal First World War in revolution, got rid of the Kaiser and literally just stopped fighting on November the 9th, 1918, inspired by the Bolshevik Russian Revolution. The struggle that ensued during a huge economic crisis of the early 20s led to a polarisation in German politics, a political polarisation. On the one hand, on the extreme left, you have the Communist Party, who talked about socialism and communism, but became more and more distorted and actually fatally wounded, I'd argue, by Stalinism. And on the other hand, you had the Nazi Party, the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party. And what was their ideology? As I've said, biological racism. They had a belief in superiority of an Aryan race. Now, this developed into promoting a biological racism with the need to exclude all the inferior races, and this exclusion could be removed, pushed aside, or murder. And most importantly for the Nazis, they linked Jewish people as one of their inferior races with communism. And Hitler claimed he was fighting against the Jewish race and Marxism. He believed it was a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy that had defeated Germany in the First World War and continued to be the main enemy of the world. And I am going to quote Mein Kampf, and I apologise for this, but you have to quote the bastards to understand them. This is Hitler then in Mein Kampf. Should the Jew, with the aid of his Marxist creed, triumph over the people of this world, his crown will be the funeral wreath of mankind. So let's look at the balance of forces in 1924. In 1924, the Nazis got 6.4% of the vote. The Labour Party, the SPD, got 26% of the vote. 4 years later, as hyperinflation is becoming a memory, the Nazis went down to 2.6%. The Labour Party, 30%. The Communist Party, 10% of the vote. So a tiny set of ideas. So how did they come to power in such a short space of time? And that is the Wall Street crash. That is the economic situation. By 1930, so the Wall Street crash was in 1929, the Nazis were getting 18.4% of the vote. In July 1932, they got 37.4% of the vote, but it wasn't enough to get elected. So another election was held in November 32, and actually the Nazis' vote dropped by 2 million. And Goebbels, who was later to be the propaganda minister for the Nazis, said the following. This is December 1932. Everywhere we are plunged into anger, strife and dissension. The situation is quite hopeless. Everything is smashed. All prospects, all hopes have quite disappeared. But by January 1933, a month later, Hitler is head of the army and the Chancellor. So what happened? How did that happen? We have to be really clear here. The German ruling class, who are not Nazis, chose Hitler and his mass movement over the prospect of a massive workers' revolt. I'm going to quote Schleicher, who was a chancellor who gave his job to Hitler. He said the following: "We are convinced that the only possible chancellor is Hitler. Any other decision would generate a general strike, if not a civil war, and the totally undesirable use of the army against the National Socialists, the Nazis, as well as against the left." So happy with them that we don't want to use it against the Nazis. And we know time and time again, history has shown us that the ruling class can survive any crisis if the working class are made to pay for it. So what was the first act of the Nazi government? First act, to disarm the working class. Before the Nazis had come to power, from about 1928, they had developed serious paramilitary cadre who would go around smashing up left-wing meetings. So they were really attacking the organised working class. In February 1933, the first decree: anyone who was seen to be an enemy of Germany could be imprisoned. In March 1933, the communists were banned. On the 1st of April, all 3 unions were banned. All other political parties were banned in July. Hitler's hatred of Marxism meant that the first camps, like in places like Dachau, concentration camps were used for communists. So in March 1933, of the 1,000 political prisoners in Dachau, communists and socialists, 100 were Jewish. The best weapon to fight against racism, to fight against what the Nazis were doing, was removed: the working class. The working class was decapitated, atomised, alienated, and the ability to look outwards and to fight was psychologically and physically removed from our class. So now I want to look at the road to the Holocaust. And we have to see it as a process. It's not a linear process, one then the other, but it is a process of racism, isolation and separation, moving on to segregation, concentration, and finally, extermination. So the racism aspect. Anti-Semitism had a long, ugly history in Europe since the early Middle Ages. But in the late 1800s, the new biological form of racism took hold. And this was exploited by the Nazis, who pointed to the Jews as the cause of the economic crisis, because they are the Bolsheviks and the communists and they're fighting all the time, and the beneficiaries of the economic crisis, because they're the bankers, they're the heads of the factories, they're the ones benefiting. And the Nazis' scapegoats and attacks on the system went deep into the middle classes. So in 1932, 12 million people, mostly middle class, voted for the Nazis. But just to say at this point, this will come up in the discussion, 13 million people voted for the left. So the racism is there as a backdrop. Moving on to the isolation and separation, what we often call today othering of Jewish people started almost immediately. So the separation in the 1933 April, Jewish civil servants and public servants were sacked. They were removed from public life. And there was some imaginative application of this by very keen bureaucrats and Nazis. So in Berlin, for instance, in 1933, 32 deaf Jews were expelled from the Deaf Relief Organisation. There were Jewish war dead, had their names removed from war memorials. I'm just giving snapshots of the kind of things that were done. In 1935, the Nuremberg decrees introduced the first racial categorisation and exclusion of Jews. And the law was called, you can get the idea of the Nazis' ideas from this, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honour. And it prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jews and extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans. And so, an example, Hans Serelman was a Jew. He was sent to a concentration camp for 7 months for giving blood to a non-Jew, and he was charged with race defilement. Moving on. The overt, in fact, the only seriously overt violent act against Jews on a mass scale in Germany was in 1938, Kristallnacht. And it was a pogrom run by the SS, the stormtroopers for the Nazis. 1,000 synagogues were attacked, 7,500 shops, 90 Jewish people were murdered, and there was acts of depravity and rape everywhere. This showed the brutality of the Nazis, what they were capable of and what they wanted to do, but it also, very importantly, showed how this was not an acceptable way to go in Germany at that time. So David Cesarini, in this excellent, very big book, there are no small books on the Holocaust, I have to tell you, on the final solution, said the following: the extent his book on the final solution. This is about Kristallnacht. The extent of the desolation stunned the population and rocked the regime. It led to a fundamental rupture in Nazi thinking. Afterwards, the regime would begin to employ new ways of dealing with the Jews in Germany, and it would never again stage anti-Jewish violence on German streets. Instead, the violence would be exported or disguised, and this is important for arguments later. The war changed everything. So in 1939, before the war had started, this is a speech, a very chilling speech from Hitler again, which is quoted widely. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevizing of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. The fate of European Jews became absolutely directly linked to the war. So Hitler invades Poland in September 1939, and he is now in charge of 3.5 million Polish Jews. And the Nazis had to... So the Nazis' plan was, in their conquered areas, was to create something called Lebensraum, living space. And it's an extreme nationalist idea of providing more space for German people. But just to say at this point, capitalist nations are always expanding, often in very violent ways. But it raised the question, we've got this space, what do we do with the Jews, and what do we do with the Poles, actually? So Himmler, who was head of the SS, said it is essential that the great German people should regard it as its chief task to destroy all Poles. So the first 6 weeks of the German invasion, actually the primary targets were Polish intelligentsia. Some 16,000 civilians were murdered and 5,000 Jewish civilians were murdered. Moving on now, so we've got this going in to try and get Lebensraum, what to do with the Jews. So the first idea, looking at segregation, was actually for expulsion. Himmler, again, I hope completely to erase the concept of Jews through the possibility of a great emigration of all Jews to a colony in Africa or elsewhere. And Madagascar was seriously discussed. They talked about how many ships and how they would do it for a couple of years. But in the meantime, they had to deal with the massive new Jewish community in their land, and this led to the ghettoization, first serious separation, segregation. And the first ghettos were set up in 1940, and the Warsaw Ghetto had a population around 500,000. Now, we have to understand these ghettos were open prisons. You got 1.5 square metres per adult to live in. They did not include children in this calculation. There was not enough food for anybody. There was not enough sanitation or resources. And this was all overseen by a group called the Judenrat, a group of Jewish leaders appointed by the Nazis to run the ghetto and deliver the quotas of people for working in the factories, and later for deportation to the death camps. And this power structure was used again in the death camps. I'm not talking much about that. I'm just highlighting what now is a method used by the Nazis. And they were very different people, the Judenrats, in different areas. So this ghettoization, with its terrible conditions, was repeated across all German-controlled areas, Vienna, Lvov, Vilna, etc., etc. And thousands of people died due to starvation and insanitary conditions and illness, and always accompanied by random shootings. So this is a report from a German military commander in May 1941 about the Warsaw Ghetto. The situation in the Jewish quarter is catastrophic. The corpses of those who have died of starvation lie in the streets. The death rate is 80% from malnutrition. The ghetto is becoming a cultural scandal, a source of infection and a breeding place of the worst subhumanity. That situation is repeated, as I say, across German-controlled areas. Now to talk about concentration, getting people together in camps. The development of the concentration camps began as soon as the Nazis took power, as I mentioned, Dachau. But these were places for not just Jews, they were trade unionists, prisoners of wars, they were labour camps. And they were for people to do work, but under terrible conditions. So the ration of calories for Poles, so Poles are seen as subhuman but not as bad as Jews, they got 600 calories a day, Jews got 400. But it wasn't yet death to all people. It was part of the war economy. And these camps served a purpose beyond the exploitation and the brutality of the inmates. They actually continued the process of othering because they really were a separation, out of sight, out of mind for thousands and thousands of people. So now to talk about the road to extermination. There was a terrible step change of murder from June 1941, from the start of Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of Russia. So the desire for Lebensraum, sorry guys, it's hot. So the desire for Lebensraum was now combined with the ideological war against the Bolsheviks, who Hitler described as the rats of the world, and there was to be absolute ruthlessness during this invasion. All Russian commissars were to be shot on sight. Nearly all Jewish men who would be seen as part of partisan resistance were to be shot. In September 1941, a Nazi general, Khai, said the following: "The struggle against Bolshevism demands ruthless and energetic measures, above all against the Jews, the main carriers of Bolshevism." Within 5 weeks of the German offensive in Russia, the number of Jews killed exceeded the total number killed in the previous 8 years of Nazi rule. And the key method was shooting. So in Kiev, in 2 days, 33,000 people were shot. And many of these atrocities were carried out with the aid of local Nazi sympathisers and collaborators who carried out pogroms as soon as the German army arrived. There was another key shift in the summer of 1941 where the army for the first time started to systematically shoot women and children as well, as part of what they called pacification of the conquered populations. So how do we get to the final solution, which is what the Nazis called the final solution of the Jewish question? Now, historians argue whether Hitler went for the final solution due to do badly, because he was starting to do badly in the war against Russia, so to get rid of the internal enemy of the lands he was conquering, or at the height of the success of the German campaign, because it was very successful early on, got very, very close to Moscow very quickly. So being able to confidently end the existence of Jewish people in the German Empire. You can argue it either way, and I'm not going to take a position on it, but it is clear that as the ongoing battle with Russia continues, decisions on what to do with the enemy of the Jewish Bolsheviks took an even more deadly turn. And so now on to the extermination. The roots of the final solution, you can argue, the mass murder of all Jews, can be found in the ideological statements of Nazis and actions that they took from the start of the war. So I'm going to give you an example of that. The biological racism and supremacy led to all undesirable elements being targeted. So in October 1939, something called Action T4 was inaugurated by the Nazis. It was a program of systematic murder of persons with physical and mental disabilities and patients for psychiatric hospitals. The first target were disabled children under the age of 3. 3,000 of them were murdered. Now, this action took mainly part between 1939 and 41, but the killings continued until the end of the war. And it's very important to understand what this shows, the Action T4, because it shows the lengths the Nazis would go to for their ideology of biological racism. And this was shown, actually, they sterilised 400,000 non-Jewish women. So 1% of the women in Germany were forcibly sterilised by the Nazis. But it was also a key to development of the actual practicalities and logistics of mass murder. First, they shot people. Then, from spring 1940, they started to use gas chambers, which were mobile trucks containing carbon monoxide. They then progressed to static huts with gas poured in, and eventually the death chambers and the use of Zyklon B. Now, the people who carried out these murders were the ideological vanguard of the Nazi, of the SS, the Einsatzgruppen. There were 4 groups of between 650 and 1,000 men, and their job was to sweep behind the advancing German army, killing as many Jews and other perceived enemies as they could. And this is just an aside. They were led by hardcore ideological Nazis. 3 of the 4 commanders held PhDs. These are not idiotic thugs. These are highly intelligent ideologues for the Nazi ideas. And it's estimated that 2 million people were killed by these groups, 1.3 million being Jewish. So the plans for the final solution, the murder of 11 million people, were formalised at something called the Wannsee Conference. It was a gathering of leading Nazis held on the 20th of January 1942. And it was explicit here. Hitler wasn't there, but everyone knew what he wanted. It was explicit that some Jews would be worked to death and the rest would be killed in the implementation of the final solution. And the key method was use of death camps. Why death camps? Firstly, as I've said, it was shooting to begin with, but actually the logistics of killing lots and lots of people, you needed a lot of manpower. You needed something more efficient to do this. Secondly, it was too public. German soldiers were sending back cards to their families, going, not how terrible it was, bragging about these things they were getting up to. And this, again, this is not something we're unfamiliar with. The shooting of, taking of selfies in Abu Ghraib, etc., is something we know about. So it was too public, and I've already said, they were worried about actually the German population's reaction to it. And another reason for changing from mass shootings to gas chambers was actually to reduce the trauma for the Einsatzgruppen carrying out the massacres. So Himmler, he went to Minsk in August 41, and he saw a massacre firsthand. And he said it was too stressful for his men. By November, he'd made arrangements for any SS men suffering ill health from having participated in executions to be provided with rest and mental health care. And it was he who decided that the transition should be made to gassing the victims, particularly the women and the children. So permanent killing centres were developed at Auschwitz, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka and other extermination camps. And these replaced the mobile death squads as the primary method of mass killing. So never before this point had people been killed on an assembly line basis. So Auschwitz, 1.1 million people killed, 900,000 Jews from all over Europe, far afield of Greece, sent to Auschwitz. And they could process, that's their word, murder, up to 24,000 people a day. So, by 1945, we've lost 6 million Jews, 4 to 6 million other people. Now we have to get back to the why. First argument, put very strongly by a man called Goldhagen, is that all Germans were racist, and that basically all Germans were guilty of exterminism. So the vast majority of Germans, he argues, were motivated to carry out the Holocaust because all Hitler did was, quote here, unleash the pent-up anti-Semitic passion of Germans. Why would I argue this is wrong? Firstly, it actually denies the facts. It ignores the revulsion over Kristallnacht. It ignores the fact that 6,000 Jews were hidden in Berlin alone, which meant they had to have, with false papers, they had to have German help to do this. In late 1941, Goebbels decided to introduce the mark to German Jews. It was in Poland they were wearing the yellow star. In Germany it hadn't happened yet. So they introduced the yellow star for German Jews, and this is what Goebbels had to say about it. It has had the opposite effect from what we intended. People everywhere are showing sympathy for them. This nation is simply not yet mature. It is full of all kinds of idiotic sentimentality. Okay, another argument. Why was there not more resistance in Germany to what was going on? First time, it's a wartime dictatorship, the Nazi regime, and the repression was enormous. If you helped anyone, you would immediately be killed. I don't know if any of you read, there's a brilliant book by Hans Verlader called Alone in Berlin, describes a couple who lost their son and they just leave postcards saying Hitler is a liar. Had to do it, so much work to do that. And when they were caught, they were executed. Really, really difficult to do. In Poland, if you helped Jews, your whole family would be killed and whole villages would be destroyed. Secondly, I've already said the working class were completely atomised, no leadership, no ability to organise. And there was, thirdly, systematic state indoctrination. So when you went to school, you would have maths lessons saying things like, the construction of a lunatic asylum costs 6 million marks. How many houses at 15,000 marks could have been built for that amount? So that's why we killed the mentally ill. Teachers spent 2 weeks a year having Nazi ideology lessons. And also, as I've said before, the full extent of what was going on was not publicised in Germany itself. And so there is a famous quote from Himmler who says, this is a page of glory about the final solution. This is a page of glory in our history which has never been written and is never to be written. Okay, so it's not true all Germans were racist. And more importantly, if this was true, then why do we need to worry about this? Because it's not going to happen anywhere else, because it's a German thing. Yeah, we can't accept that. Second argument, that there was an economic reason for this, that the ruling class benefited from exploiting Jewish and other slave labour. And when they were no longer useful, then they could be murdered. Now, there were some companies, such as IG Farben and the pharmaceuticals, who did make profits directly from the experimentations on twins at Auschwitz and other things like that. And their profits tripled between 1939 and 43. IBM also did very well. But actually, the key to the success for German capitalism was the war economy itself. This is what increased profits for steelmakers such as Krupp's. The German ruling class turned a blind eye to the excesses of the Nazis as they expanded and took over companies in Poland, etc., swallowed up the rival firms. So exploiting the Jews was not particularly profitable. And actually the racial element of the exploitation meant that actually the labourers never had enough food. They were weak, they were unproductive, they never had scarce resources put into the places they were working. They were literally not economically viable for capital. And at key arguments in the war, vital train stock, vital things that were needed would be diverted to carry Jews to death camps. So in November 1942, the army are getting bogged down, starting to get bogged down in Russia. Trains and then ships were used to transport 223 Norwegian Jews from Oslo, 1,000 miles to Auschwitz, so that they could be murdered. Not rational, not economically or militarily. And the Nazis have their own agenda. They have their own goals. They pushed into the German state. They acted in their own interests and they controlled more and more of the state and they rewarded their cadres. So they have their own separate dynamic to what's going on. So the two main positions put by historians about the Holocaust are between the structuralists and the intentionalists. Intentionalism is the idea that the Holocaust happened because the Nazi leadership wanted it to happen. And the structuralists, I'm going to put this very crudely, there are huge books written about this, the structuralists argue it was circumstances that shaped the policy to the Jews, and that it was the twists and turns of the war that culminated in Auschwitz through a series of what they called cumulative radicalisations. Now, I would argue that neither position on its own is correct. The structuralist argument reduces the role of the Nazi leadership in the final solution. There was a particular decision made at the Wannsee Conference and carried out from the top of the Nazi machine to the bottom. Whether Hitler actually instructed directly to exterminate all the Jews or expected his highly competitive Nazi leadership to make it happen doesn't reduce their whole responsibility for the Holocaust. The intentionalist argument, however, doesn't explain that they wanted it, therefore it happened. It doesn't explain actually how the actions and policies towards and against Jews did change dramatically as the war progressed. It went from expulsion, seriously talking about expulsion, to the factories of death. And I would argue that there is a relationship between the Nazi ideology and the changing nature of the war. It's dialectic, you can't divorce the two of them. So fundamentally, why? Why did this happen? You can't understand the Holocaust without understanding capitalism. The depth of the capitalist political and economic crisis led the German ruling class to choose a fascist mass movement as built on racism and anti-establishment hatred to physically smash the German working class. The war itself brought the questions of how to deal with enormous populations over enormous areas and huge, enormous populations of people who were seen as subhuman, or if Jewish, also an enormous threat. The Nazis held state power, which they used for extreme nationalist aims, the Lebensraum, which combined racism with modern technology to produce the factories of death, culminating in the Holocaust. That's how I would argue it. Importantly, this was not inevitable. Even then, even at the factory death stage, this was not inevitable. Who could have stopped it? The Allies. Before the war had started in 1939, the United States, everyone knew about that. They'd seen Kristallnacht, they knew what was going on in Germany. Out of the 309,000 people who'd applied for an American visa, 27,000 were given it. Those who didn't get out perished. Even the visa application itself, the process was terrible. You had 4 feet of a form to fill out on both sides. You had to submit 6 copies. You had to have 2 US sponsors, and each sponsor had to have 2 people vouching for them. Really difficult. The UK kinder transport, hailed as this marvellous thing to allow Jewish children to come to Britain. Yes, there were 10,000 Jewish children who came to, but they were 10,000 children without their parents. And there were many more who could have come. When the war started, America and the Allies knew early on about atrocities against the Jews. There were brave people escaping from the ghettos just to tell them what was happening. So Jan Karski, a Polish resistance fighter, saw Roosevelt in 1943. What was Roosevelt's response to it? He literally just kept asking how the horses were. Were they being well treated? So the Allies they also knew about Auschwitz. There are photos which, if you go to Auschwitz, enrage you of the death camps, the railways, the crematoria, the smoke coming out of the out of the crematoria. Those were from August 1944, but people knew about Auschwitz well before that. Nothing was done. Between July and October 1944, there were 2,700 Allied bombers passing over the camp. The camp shook from attacks at nearby installations. They chose not to do it, not to do anything about it. And if they'd done it, if you say that that's the first time they knew anything, August 44, they will still have saved tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives if they'd bombed then. Okay. Could the Jews have resisted more? Could people in the middle of this maelstrom of terror resisted more? And I would argue, first, because some people claim that Jews went meekly to their death. That is absolutely not true. I would argue, firstly, that I'm going to give you some examples, and then, So the famous example, first of all, is of the Warsaw Ghetto. April 1943, 300,000 people have already been transported to the death camps. 100,000 had starved to death. And that's when 750 very poorly armed Jewish fighters took on 2,000 German soldiers. And they fought, these soldiers, for 6 weeks against all the odds. Most were killed, all expected to die. In the end, they had to set fire to the ghetto to win this fight, the Nazis. And the key, according to Marek Edelman, who was one of the 5 commanders, was purely to pick the time and place of our deaths. This was an inspiration across the whole of Europe. Less famous, but hugely significant, I would argue, is the Minsk ghetto, which was surrounded by barbed wire, not walls, so it was easier to get out of. 10,000 Jews, led by children and non-Jewish supporters, escaped and got into the neighbouring forests. They then supported the partisans who carried out attacks against German soldiers, and most of those people actually survived the war. What about in the death camps themselves? In the death camps, resistance can be to try and escape, absolutely, to do bad work, create bulletins, to inform people, just simply to survive. And in all the death camps, these forms of resistance were carried out. But you have to understand, these were such cruel conditions. The numbers involved were tiny. I'm not trying to say that people fighting everywhere, but there was resistance. So in Sobibor, death camp, in 1943, a resistance group run by a Jew and a Soviet prisoner of war lured SS officers into a storehouse to look at stolen Jewish fur coats. They killed 11 of those officers, including the camp commander, and 300 managed to escape into the forests from that, 200 of them shielded by poles to the end of the war. Treblinka, August 1943, arms were stolen, the camp was set fire to, they managed to destroy gas chambers, 600 escaped. Most were captured, but both camps were closed afterwards because of this resistance. Auschwitz, so one of my favourite stories, women were working in the armaments factories, would, under their fingernails, get dynamite that they smuggled back. At the end of every day, they kept little stores of it, and they had an uprising led by political Poles and Jews. They attacked the guards with knives and axes and bullets, and they blew up Crematorium 4. Nobody got out, but it was an amazing thing. And if you go to Auschwitz, and I strongly urge that you do, if you can still see Crematorium 4. So why is resistance important? Because under the worst conditions, people can fight back. It shows human spirit, and it always inspires other people to do the same. But the key is to never get there again. Yeah, the resistance didn't stop the Holocaust. In conclusion, this is humanity at its lowest, and we have to understand how this could happen, because there are increasing numbers of people who want to do this kind of thing again. The conditions of crisis, economic crisis, polarisation are ongoing, and the processes of othering, of isolating groups is deepening. And the main targets of the scapegoating are Muslims and migrants. They still are. But I'm going to come back to this. Let's look at the European elections. In 14 European countries, fascist or far-right racist populist parties got more than 10% of the vote. In Hungary, the Fidesz party got the largest share of any country, 52% of the vote. And they are built on, their politics are built on Islamophobia, racism against the Roma, and anti-Semitism. Because although the Islamophobia and anti-migrant racism is the daily bread and butter of the far right and Nazis, it's anti-Semitism which provides an ideological heart for their movements. It's the way that you can look at the economic crisis, blame it on the hidden hand of Jewish power, and there's no other group that they can use that for. And so we see the massacre at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. We see the chants in Charlottesville of the Jews will not replace us. We see the constant attacks across Europe on George Soros, the Hungarian Jewish billionaire and philanthropist. And it happens on these shores as well. Farage has distanced himself from open Islamophobia, but has joined in the attacks on Soros, saying he is the biggest danger, this is a quote, he's the biggest danger to the entire Western world, this one man who's Jewish. So capitalism is still here. The crisis means the conditions here. We know what happened before. We have something that the people in the 30s did not have. So our job is to unite and organise with the vast majority of people who do not want to see another Holocaust. So we have to fight against all forms of racism, and the time to do this is now.
Hi, I'm Polly Smith from Ipswich. Can you all hear this? Good, right. And I came in a bit late, so it might have been mentioned beforehand, but 6 million Jews were not the only people who were murdered by Hitler. The figure is actually 12 million. 12 million people were killed. And amongst the very first were disabled people like myself. We were tortured, experimented, and killed. And that happened because we were so-called abnormal. We weren't abnormal, we exist. And I think, yes, we've got to remember Jewish people who were murdered. But we must not forget Hitler's other victims. There were 12 million people killed. Please remember them, and please educate people to say 12 million were killed. Thank you.
In the green t-shirt at that, and then
I also came about 20 minutes late as well, so I apologise if I missed anything. I think you might have mentioned that at the start of your speech. I don't know because I wasn't here, and I apologise again for that. But it's more, I think, I do think that we need to learn from history, because I do think that if we don't learn what happened in the Holocaust, these things are likely to happen again. And you see what's happened with people like Farage, Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and everything. So, I mean, these people need to be opposed. And the best way to oppose them is not just learning about it in school or learning about it at meetings like this, if you don't already know about what happened in the Holocaust. But I think it's also joining workers' struggle and stuff, because that's the best way to resist fascists. Because, I mean, if you don't learn the mistakes of the past, you're never going to beat the mistakes of the past. So I think the SWP is the best party in terms of resisting oppression for all sorts of people. And I would say if you're not a member, I would advise you to join and continue your struggle to beat the fascists.
Yeah, I just have a few thoughts about what Anna was saying about the process of othering and use of the term ethnicity, because my understanding was that, I mean, before the war, and in Germany at least, the Jewish population in Germany was very highly integrated into the rest of society. So the purpose of othering was almost seemed like, correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed almost like a case of inventing an ethnicity so that you could then start othering them. I mean, and the question is, I mean, is that a fair assessment of what happened? And also a general point about sort of anti-Semitism as practiced by the Nazis compared with real or alleged anti-Jewish remarks elsewhere, is that if you were categorised as Jewish under the Nazis, there's absolutely no way you could stop being Jewish. You couldn't convert to something else. Whereas, possibly, if an Islamic fundamentalist makes anti-Jewish remarks, if you converted, then they, in their mind, that might be different. But which I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it seems to be qualitatively different from what happened under the Nazis.
Yeah. The speaker said that she doesn't take stand on the question when the plan was decided upon, the final solution plan, but when, or whether at the peak of the peak of the power of the Nazis, or when it went down. So I would very much say that it was at the peak when it was taken, because Himmler at the end of June 1941 gave the task of the plan of annihilation of the Jewish people to Heydrich at the end of June 1941. So this was the Wannsee conference. Half a year later was came only from this this order in June 41. So this in June 41 was certainly the peak of the power of the Nazi movement. So I wouldn't agree on that. And the second is, I think that you said you would criticize the intentionalists and the structuralists, and you had a third explanation which I didn't quite understand. You said capitalism is responsible for it. That's of course, but capitalism is responsible because, of course it is, because it gave the Nazis the power to rule. But the real question is why, although there were no economic interests of the ruling class, the economically ruling class, the capitalists in the Holocaust, and they had no. They had no intention to kill the Jewish people, but nevertheless it happened. So this is a real question which I think you can only explain with a intentionalist approach, which means the racist ideology of the Nazis, which got such a power independently from the economic ruling class that they were able to fulfill this plan, although the ruling class didn't have any economic interest in it. I think this, therefore, you can only explain it with the intentions of the Nazis.
Yeah, there's Anna said in a talk, raised a quote from Mein Kampf, and it's a horrible read, Mein Kampf, for obvious reasons. It ranks perhaps alongside what Primo Levi said about Hearst's, one of the commandants at Auschwitz, autobiography, for want of a better word, when he wrote his memoirs, again for want of a better word, before he was executed, after being imprisoned. It's like reading Pure Evil. And it's like that indeed, but there's one of the quotes from it which a lot of people will know, of course, from Hitler in Mein Kampf, among others, is that only one thing could have stopped our movement if our adversaries had understood from its first inception to crush it with the utmost brutality. And I'll come back to that, why it's important, I think. But you see the brutality. People will know about the Freikorps. There's a lot of very interesting books on the Freikorps, who became some of the stormtroopers, became some of the SA and so on. And I wonder if Anna could touch on the role of the Freikorps in some of the roles of the Freikorps, in key individuals in the Freikorps in the Holocaust, what became the Holocaust. But one of the reasons I think we some of us, socialists, revolutionary socialists, go on and on and on about the need for a united front in practice is because of that. Because of that quote from Hitler, and because one of the times Unite Against Fascism, alongside SUTR, runs a trip every year to Auschwitz, and I would encourage people to go if you can. There's other concentration camps, as of course, as Cesarani said in his outstanding book, which Anna referred to. I'd urge everyone to read that. Bookmarks will have it. And as Cesarani says, Treblinka, Theresienstadt, Sobibor, and so on. Incredible scale of murder in a short space of time. One of the things at Auschwitz is a document from Hearst, the commandant at the time, and there was a number of KPD prisoners were arrived at Auschwitz, and he makes a joke. It's all written down. It's in the last panels and so on. He makes what he thinks is a joke to one of his pals in the SS. Some of the KPD have arrived. Now perhaps they can resolve their differences with some of the SPD here. Now, I haven't got time to go into it, but you think the bastard saw that. That bastard saw that. Understandable, of course, why a number of SPD people didn't want a united front KPD didn't want a united front with the SPD. Murder of Rosa Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and so on. The man Trotsky, other people will talk about it. The man Trotsky, amongst a handful of people, did see a need for a united front, even though SPD leading members had played a criminal role in the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. That's why we go on and on and on. Some of us go banging on about whatever else the difference is. And Christ, the pressure on not to have a united front in those times in Germany, obviously enormous and deep-seated and well felt. So that's what I'd say, really. The need for a united front, whatever else, a united front in action, not a united front of passive. We all agree in lovely bureaucratic rooms and so on with the great and good of the society, but a united front of all kinds of people of a key nature to stop the fascists today.
Thank you.
I think we need to be careful about saying there was no economic interest and therefore it's got nothing to do with capitalism. Brexit, there is no economic interest, but Boris Johnson is no anti-capitalist and nor is Farage. Capitalism is a system of economic and social relations, and those social relations, the interests of the state. Hitler was a conscious counter-revolutionary. That was what drove him. The Jews, in a sense, were drawn into that process, but that was a driver. In terms of when the decision was taken, if you refer to June 41, it was called the Commissar Order. It was about exterminating the commissars. Again, the Jews are drawn in by accident. I want to move on to Anna talked about, quite rightly, biological racism. The Nazis weren't the only biological racists in Europe. Herbert Spencer in Britain, France, the leading ideologist was a Frenchman. The Kaiser made anti-Semitic statements. To see it as the Nazis come from somewhere else with biological racism was rife. The problem was this counter-revolutionary movement was brought into power with its biological racism. It didn't come from nowhere. And the final thing to say is that the current, I want to say anyway, the current fascist movements are far more overtly racist than the Nazis were. The Nazis, if you look at their posters, 3% of their posters, the 3% of their posters covered Jews, the rest was about the economy, the Marxists, etc., etc. And the same for the newspaper headlines. 5% covered that. It's, in other words, the modern Nazis, the modern fascists, have taken the racist element and they're pushing that, but we shouldn't interpret the Nazi phenomenon as purely about the Jews, etc., etc. It had much deeper roots, and you have to connect it to the social context.
Red t-shirt, yeah. And then the man in the blue shirt.
So I am from Manchester and was involved in the Northwest campaign against Tommy Robinson. And one day we were doing a stall outside one of the universities and we were saying, stop this Nazi. And somebody stopped and they said, that's a bit far, like, he's not a Nazi. And we were kind of like, well, actually, the Nazis, they didn't start with the death camps. Like, it was a build-up of where they got there. And I think it's really important to emphasise that, the ideology that Tommy Robinson is pushing, where does that end? It's really important to stamp it out now whilst we still have that option, and to kind of oppose them where they rear their heads and stuff, rather than just being like, oh, well, let them say what they want. It's never going to get there, because we can see where that does end. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think a terrific talk and an excellent discussion. I want to just make a couple of points if I can, and if I'm going on for too long, I'll no doubt the chair will shut me up in a minute. The first point is about the illogicality, or so it seems to us, the illogicality of the anti-Semitism. Anna mentioned a number of examples. I've also seen that on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, and the invasion of Europe, when the Russians had also launched a major offensive on the Eastern Front, one of the main things coming out of German High Command was how to get the Thessalonican Jews to Auschwitz. Now, that seems to us an absolute madness with what's going on in the Western and Eastern fronts. How to get the trains to Greece to get those few hundred Jews to Auschwitz just seems complete madness at that stage in the war. German industrialists were also complaining all the time about they would try and train up some Jews and then they'd be taken away and murdered, and new ones would be arriving, and so on. And I think that what we have to understand is that it seems illogical, but for the Nazi system as it had developed, the way Anna and other comrades in the room have described, it was not illogical. For them, the whole process was one of trying to keep their cadre together. And as things began to go downhill, if you like, during the war, after Stalingrad, I suppose, or the Battle of Stalingrad, the one thing that held the Nazis together was their desire to rid Europe of the Jews. And that therefore becomes something that becomes a cement that holds our cadre together as things begin to get more and more difficult. And therefore, capitalism needed the Nazis. It did not need particularly the Holocaust, but the Nazis needed the Holocaust because that's something that held them together. I think we need to understand that. The second point is that I think Anna made an exceptionally strong point that about the Goldhagen idea of blaming the Germans for the Holocaust rather than the Nazis for the Holocaust. If you go to the new museum in Warsaw, Museum of Polish history, there's a big section about the Second World War and the Holocaust. All the time they refer to what the Germans did to the Poles and the Jewish Poles in particular. Nowhere do they talk about the Nazis and their Nazi sympathizers in Poland doing anything about it. In fact, I think it's a crime in Poland to talk about Polish collaboration with the Nazis during the Second World War. And this is an attempt to whitewash the Nazis and say there was something specific about the Germans. And I think we have to oppose that very, very strongly.
Yeah, I mean, you've brought up, Anna, about the question of emigration from Germany in the 30s and the limits that were put on it by the United States and Britain in particular. And obviously, that's horrible parallels with what's happening today in terms of, Fortress Europe and so forth. But one of the things as well was that there was a lot of requested emigration to Palestine at the time, that the British government put limitations on the visas that were offered and cut the visas for emigration from Germany and occupied Germany to Palestine, and that there was, it's argued there was opposition within Palestine itself to increasing the number of visas that were there. And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to follow on from this idea that the ruling class kind of sits somewhere in their palaces and make these completely calm and rational decisions about what they're going to do, and then just carry them out as if everybody else is just their puppets. This isn't true. An economic crisis is also a political crisis for the ruling class, and they will reach for extreme solutions in terms of what's around them at the time and what they had around them in a crucial time. You have to understand the period since the Second World War of complete turbulence, particularly in Germany, virtual almost to a revolution and so on, and that therefore what they had to hand in order to smash that was the Nazi Party, and the fact that did things that were illogical from the point of view of capitalism is less important than the fact that they were there when the ruling class politically needed them. And Donnie's right to raise the question of Brexit. Remember Boris's famous comment, "Fuck business." You know, this isn't a solution that the British ruling class want. But the collapse of the political centre across Europe at the moment means that the kind of stable means of the kind of old centre-right, centre-left coalition is no longer there for them to bring stability in the face of the crisis, and therefore we can expect strange things to happen in politics that don't look on the face of it like they make sense to the ruling class. And I just wanted to raise in that context, really, whether what we're seeing in terms of fascism at the moment might suggest a slightly different trajectory, because what you had in the 30s was a kind of, a Nazi party that had grown from street battles and street violence into the kind of unit that the ruling class could look to. What we see at the moment with the rise of the far right and the populist right is much more them being able to offer a potential solution to the crisis to people in the absence of other people doing it. And the effect of that on British politics is really to push politics to the right, where anti-immigration politics is getting normalised and all the rest of it. Is it possible for fascists to come to power in that situation and then build the sort of organisation that the Nazi Party had in the 1930s? In other words, to do it the other way around. And I think just raising that possibility doubles really what we should be trying to do, which is not just, as the comrade at the back quite rightly said, yes, support workers' struggles because we need to build a left alternative, very, very important, but we also need specific anti-Nazi propaganda, and in particular countering them on the streets every time they try to march, every time they try to hold a meeting, every time they stand in an election and try to gain respectability, to be out there and smash them right at the beginning and stop them from building up such an organisation is absolutely vital.
I'd like to mention something nobody ever mentions, which is Bulgaria, which was the only country in Europe that didn't transport any Jews. Nobody ever seems to mention it. 50,000 Jews weren't transported because the people of Bulgaria resisted it. There were 3 days of demonstrations in Sofia. The farmers in Bulgaria, the Farmers Union and the land-owning rich farmers also protested, and they said that if any Jews, they tried to transport any Jews, they'd lay on the farmers would lay on the railway tracks to stop them. And I also think there's a danger with the left just quoting this figure of 6 million Jews like it's some kind of objective truth, because there were probably more Jews killed. You know, the David Irvings of the world, the Holocaust in I say it was 250,000. Actually, probably more. If you take the Anna mentioned the Roma and the Sinti, and a lot of the travellers weren't registered in Europe because they didn't have any permanent names of address. So probably considerably more gypsies were murdered than the figures suggest. So it may be 20-30% more people were killed in the Holocaust. We need, when the Holocaust deniers come around again, which they will do, we need to counter this instead of just saying 6 million. And I'd like to ask Anna a more personal question. Is that your brother, that Donny Gluckstein? Yeah.
Yes,
that's your brother, is it? Yeah, I thought it was. I've read that one. Neil's lent me Donny's other book, because he's written another one which I haven't read because Neil's asked me for it back. So yeah, it's a bloody good book. That, apart from what he says about Poland, which is I'm not so convinced about. That's the only essence.
Right, the comrades at the back and the striking thing.
Yeah, I'd like to say what happens if we don't call the Nazis and fascists Nazis and fascists. I think it's very interesting what happened with Tommy Robinson in Barrow. We've got the man in Barrow who actually all he did was shout at him Nazi or fascist, and that silenced him. He wanted to actually be able to talk and make some points. He wasn't able to. He was just sort of driven out of Barrow, and we know what happened in the election. He was actually defeated. Now, I've got 2 French comrades staying with me at the moment, and we've had some arguments, not debates, more friendly than arguments, than about what's happening in France. We know that Marine Le Pen is making headway. They've got 20% of the election results, and we've actually talked about, well, why? I think I made the point that why has nobody ever actually challenged her in the way that she should be challenged, which is essentially, we know that she comes from a fascist pedigree. Her father was a fascist. The people surrounding her, the Russian funders, are also supporters of a fascist sort of ideology. And I remember spending 2 years ago a holiday in France when the election was on. Loads of Marine Le Pen posters with no defacement, no graffiti, no scribbles over them. We spent most of the holidays having to draw moustaches on the woman and actually writing things about it, which are in our best French, saying this, this party is a fascist party and you should not be supporting her. The only time she's ever been called a fascist is when she comes to Britain. She comes to Oxford and the demonstrations are there. The Unite Against Fascism is a very important organisation, and I have to agree with Paul when he says we have to have a united front on this, and we have to name things as they are. We can't just sort of go for the soft option, which in France unfortunately they have, and now they're landed with a sort of quite numerous fascist party. So I think we've got to stop thinking in those terms, that we've got to treat it mildly. We've got to congratulate the Barrow comrade who saw Tommy Robinson off, and join Unite Against Fascism, join the group that's doing the most as it happens, both in London and Barrow and everywhere we possibly have to raise our heads. So come and join us and we'll defeat them.
Right, so I'll try and get through this. First, the question on Palestine. I think, firstly, obviously the Palestinian question is one that's related, is one that's a separate question, and when we're discussing the Holocaust, that's the key to this, is the race of the Holocaust. But the agreement, the Havara agreement, where actually goods and people were sent to Palestine, was taken in desperate circumstances, and we have to understand any way to get out was something that we would understand. And in fact, Tony Cliff, who's a founding member of this organisation, married a German Jew off a boat from Germany in Palestine to make sure that he could stay. And also, very importantly, the Nazis didn't care whether you were a Zionist or a Bund member. You unite Zionists and socialists together to stop the Nazis. And in Warsaw, it was the young Zionists who united with the Bund members, socialists such as Edelman, to fight the Nazis. Secondly, in terms of Bulgaria, thanks for raising that, comrade. Also, actually, Denmark. Denmark, the government, actually got all of the Jews out of Denmark so that no one was murdered. So it could be done, but the other governments didn't choose to do that. Thirdly, the question about Germany being high culture, a safe place. Actually, Germany was seen as the safest place to go to escape anti-Semitism from Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was in a different place, was still, because of the kind of later development economically, the Jews kind of fell into this easily scapegoatable place between feudalism and capitalism, and actually anti-Semitism was much worse in Eastern Europe. So the Germans did have to work hard to other Jews in that country, but they did it very ideologically. And I just want to draw attention now. I've talked about the PhDs. Generation identity are those modern, very intelligent, very ideological warriors for the Nazis. And so we can never, wherever we are, take it for granted that people will not go that way. But again, they still had to keep things a bit quieter in Germany than elsewhere. The big question about whether it was the height of the German events in Russia or the depth which led to the final solution. I would argue, firstly, the reason I'm not taking a position on it is because it's something I would have to read a lot about, and I don't think it's a crucial part of this debate. Those are very specific circumstances at that time to do with the war and what was happening. We're not going to have those specifics. We've got crisis, we've got racists and Nazis, but that's why I've not taken a position on that debate, and I see it as a process. Yes, June, then Himmler in August said drive all the women and the children into the swamps. So you can see the process. It's still before January. But it was January when they said it out loud. So that's why I'm not taking a position on that. In terms of the question around, I said it was capitalism. I'm sorry that that's how it came over. I really didn't want to say that. What I want to say firstly is capitalism as a backdrop, because you couldn't have this without it, obviously. But actually, there's another part to it, isn't it? Capitalism treats workers as cogs. We are all part of the machinery. We can be thrown on the scrap heap if we're not useful. Just people become elements and objects in a way in this system that they haven't before. And more than that, the competition and the racism is the heart of capitalism. And so it was particular circumstances in Nazi Germany, which I would argue, that's why I don't take intentionalist versus structuralist, it was the relationship between the Nazi ideology and state machinery with the actual process of the war that ended up in the death factories. They were very serious about Madagascar. They had all sorts of plans, what they were talking about, what they do with France, etc. So I think we can't see it as they wanted it, so it happened. I think yes, they wanted it in different ways, but the Nazis had their own dynamic and the war had its own dynamic. And the question about the illogicality of it, we live in a completely illogical, irrational world. You take client states. So I don't believe that the British and American ruling class are really happy that Saudi Arabia, their main ally in the Middle East, is involved in this war in Yemen. They still supply it with arms. It doesn't necessarily make sense for them. That's Saudi Arabia doing its own sub-imperialist activity. But it's getting on with it, and we're still giving them. Climate change. It will kill everybody. Right? Even rich people who are now buying mountains in New Zealand will still be affected by climate change, and the system will stop working. They're wedded to fossil fuels. It's not a logical system, but it has its own dynamic of competition and profit at all costs, and therefore moves and snakes around, and ruling class people will, as Sue said, they'd rather just everyone go to work, get on the bloody tubes, have a miserable time, go home and shut up. But every now and again, they have to go with more brutal forces. And lastly, we've talked very much about the United Front, absolutely agree with that. But actually, fundamentally, the reason I bring it back to capitalism, we are seeing the rise of racism, we will see genocides, we will see wars, we will see destruction, unless we actually go beyond the United Front to fight racism and actually build a revolutionary movement to smash capitalism. There is no way around that if we want to stop more Holocausts. So join the revolutionary movement, comrades.